I'm Alan Murray with the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here at the U.S. Treasury Building with the man of the House, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner, conducting a DIG dialogue. Secretary Geithner, thanks very much for being here.
Nice to see you, Alan.
I think you know how this works. I'm merely a prop in this exercise. My job is to ask the questions that have been offered up by the DIG online community. There were thousands of questions proposed, and then members of the community voted on those questions. I'm going to ask you the top 10. First one came from Borez, B-O-R-E-Z. These people don't always use their real names, but that's his DIG name. 1,134 DIGs. Why has the Federal Reserve Bank never been audited?
You know, the Fed actually is subject to very comprehensive oversight by the Congress, by a series of external auditors. And it does play this very important role in the system, and that requires that Congress have the ability to do a very careful review of how it conducts its operations. But very important, as I'm sure people understand, that you want to keep politics out of monetary policy. And there are good reasons for that. You know, we went through centuries of financial crisis in the United States, at least two, before the Fed was established. Those crises were produced in part by the fact that we didn't have a central bank that had independence, ability to deal with these kind of things. And you need to keep those kind of things away from political influence that can compromise the effectiveness of policy.
But as this shows, there clearly is a group of people out there that feels very passionately about this. The third question on the list was 712 DIGs, was from Moto Bike Man, who said, what is your position on Ron Paul's House Resolution 1207, which, as I understand it, calls for a comprehensive audit of the Fed? Why does this persist if, as you say, the Fed is already fully audited?
Well, the Fed is dramatically more transparent than it was, is subject to very comprehensive oversight and audits. But there are certain things about what the Fed does that, again, you need to make sure that you preserve as independent of political influence. And that line is a line that we don't want to cross. And I think that even the sponsor of that bill recognizes how important it is to us to have the Fed independent of politics. And I'm sure many of the people concerned about the Fed's role in the system will understand that it would be problematic for the country if you let politicians come in and shape conduct of monetary policy in the country.
You don't want to cross the line, but does this kind of concern indicate that maybe the line needs to be moved, that maybe the Fed needs to be more transparent than it's been in the past?
Yeah, I do. I think it's very important, and I think this chairman has gone a long way to open up the workings of the Fed so that people can assess them. And remember, what the Fed does every day, people can see, and they make their judgment about whether they're having the right impact in terms of making sure we're sustaining growth with low inflation. Those actions are subject to the test of the market, public opinion, really every day, every hour. You can see, people can judge for themselves whether the Fed is doing what it's supposed to do under the laws of the land.
Well, some of them clearly don't like what they see. The ninth question on the list was from Zwendkas, 357 DIGs. He wrote, you are a member of the Federal Reserve. I think he meant you were a member of the Federal Reserve, a group that so thoroughly mismanaged our monetary policy that they helped create a massive housing bubble because of the foolish loans and speculation enabled by low interest rates. And then you were involved in a horribly mismanaged bailout that hasn't freed up credit markets and can't even account for all it has spent. Why are you running the Treasury Department, was the end of the question. How do you respond? And that was number 9 on the list.
I'm running the Treasury because the President asked me to do it, and the Senate confirmed me for that position. This is a terrible mess we're in as a country, and this crisis had a lot of causes. One of the causes was that monetary policy around the world was too loose, too long. Interest rates were too low. And so you had
Was it just a misjudgment by the Fed?
Well, again, the Fed moved to tighten interest rates way ahead of other countries. But as the Fed tightened, most countries around the world still kept interest rates very low. And you had this huge increase in wealth around the world, creating resources that were looking for investment opportunities. And that money flowed into the United States and pushed down long-term interest rates, even as the Fed tightened. And that did help contribute to the housing boom we saw. But that boom we saw here was present in many countries around the world. It was a broad, global monetary policy judgment that helped produce that. But that was not the only thing. We also had very systematic failures in supervision and regulation that allowed a huge amount of leverage to build up, risk to build up outside the traditional protections and constraints. And those misjudgments by people running financial institutions, and those failures in supervision brought this economy to the edge of collapse.
Some people do wonder why, given this history, it makes sense now to give more power to the Federal Reserve as your financial reform bill does.
I want to go back to the last part of that question, though. People want to look back over this crisis with the benefit of a little more perspective and make judgments about what we got right, what we got wrong. We did not move soon enough to put in place powerful enough measures to contain the damage of this crisis. We waited too long. We came into the crisis without adequate tools, not just to prevent crises, to prevent this kind of buildup and leverage, excess risk-taking we saw, but to contain the damage of failure when it happened. Those were tragic mistakes. That's what made this crisis so much more damaging than it should have been, and that's why it's so important that we pass regulatory reform, financial reform, that gives us better powers to prevent crises and to manage them better. And that will require changing a lot of things.
Another question, or another institution that's very much on the mind of the DIG community is Goldman Sachs. Larry JR 88 asked, this is the second question with 728 digs. He asked, Goldman Sachs is a large profit-seeking company which you are a part of. Isn't it a conflict of interest to funnel tax dollars into this private company using your new position as Secretary of the Treasury, keeping in mind that you and your old buddies benefit monetarily? Maybe I'm mistaken, but isn't this a textbook example of political corruption? Were you ever employed by Goldman Sachs?
I have never worked for Goldman Sachs. In fact, I've spent almost my entire professional life since I left school working in the public sector as a public servant.
Do you own any stock in Goldman Sachs?
I don't.
Have you ever done any work for Goldman Sachs, been
No.
paid for Goldman Sachs anyway? So where does this...
You know, it's like the thing about our age. You know, these things get some salience in currency. It's kind of crazy. But it does demonstrate a really important thing, which is it is very important that people understand that the people that hold these jobs, people that work in these positions, need to be held to the highest standards of integrity, and we would never, ever have people in these jobs who would do anything for the benefit of an individual company or individual firm. And that is a very important obligation that all of us have.
But that's a serious question that lies behind this. There's another question here. It's the fifth question from Key THB with 579 digs. It says, how do you feel about the revolving door between high job positions in the Treasury Department and Goldman Sachs? You worked for Bob Rubin, who ran Goldman Sachs before he was Treasury Secretary.
I worked for him as a civil servant at the Treasury.
But while he was Treasury Secretary.
Well, and while he was Treasury Secretary, not at Goldman Sachs.
Not at Goldman Sachs, right. Hank Paulson was your predecessor as Secretary of the Treasury. He ran Goldman Sachs. Steve Friedman, who was co-head of Goldman Sachs, was the chairman of your board.
At my request.
At your request, at the New York Federal Reserve Board. I think you have some Goldman staff. Your chief of staff was a lobbyist for Goldman Sachs. Clearly, this makes some people nervous.
Let me just say, these are deeply honorable men, great public statesmen, willing to come serve their country in very challenging times, and did exceptionally good things for the country. It's very important to recognize that. We're in a position where this government was forced to do exceptional things to save the economy from the brink of catastrophe. And the people of this country need to make sure we have people in these jobs here with experience in markets, so that as we negotiate with these firms to protect the taxpayer, make sure we're getting our money back, that we have people that understand these markets, can actually understand them. So we will always be, as the Treasury has always done, we will always be looking to people with experience in the financial community, in business community, come in these jobs, because that is important for the American people. And just one important fact, we're making some progress even already in walking back some of the broad investments the government had to make in the industry, and we're doing a relatively good job at earning a good return for the taxpayer. Just to give you one example, the average return we've had on the $80 billion of capital of investments the government made that we've now had repaid, the average return for us is roughly 16% an annual rate. That's
Can you talk about the Goldman Sachs investment?
Higher than that.
Higher than 16.
I think the Goldman thing is in the mid-20s. But the important thing is that you need to have people in these jobs. These are complicated, difficult in any times. They're exceptionally difficult, complicated in a crisis like this. And the American people need to have people here who understand and can negotiate effectively, can be the other side of things to make sure we're protecting the financial interest of the American people.
Okay, but key period